So a few weeks ago, I had this trouble from a gambling problem that I have. The Cardinals and the Cubs are playing in the baseball, and I ended up had to wear this ugly shirt to preach in. I've been sick for about 3 weeks, and I really think that I could trace a lot of that back to having to put on that Cubs shirt. And then I saw that this week, I didn't go buy one of those things. Somebody loaned it to me, and it's hanging in my closet, and I'm like, maybe God's just saying I need to get this out of my house, and that would help to clear things up. And then yesterday, my wife is wearing a Cubs t-shirt around the house. Her dad's a Cubs fan, and I'm like, honey, you've never looked so bad. I don't understand why you... Things to not say to your wife. I'm just kidding, right? Last week, we started talking about this guy, Samson, in the Bible. And because we talk about the Bible and things. And so, but we started talking about this man's stories found in Judges in the Old Testament. And if you were here last week, some of the things that we were saying about this guy was that, we know he had this super strength. He had this special calling on his life. He had this relationship with God, that God had him for a special purpose. And he had taken this vow that was talked about in the Old Testament, known as the Nazirite vow. An angel had come and told his mother that, hey, you're going to have this son, and he's going to be this kind of person and take this special vow and set himself apart for God. But we talked about how this guy, although he had a lot of strength, he had a weak will. And that because of his attitude, because of some of the decisions he made, he had a lot of struggles in his life, and it was kind of an ongoing thing. And some of the things, listen, you can always go back and well, not always, but generally speaking, you can go to our website and hear past messages. Sometimes we have technical issues, but not very often and things. But you can go back and listen to the things that we were saying. Samson he lived his life in a way to where he had a lust for things, and he would see something and say, hey, I want it. And last week, in his story, he saw this lady from that was a Philistine, which was another group. It wasn't the nation of people that Samson was from. And but he saw this woman; she was pretty, and he decided, hey, I want her, and that's the wife for me. He lived with a sense of entitlement. He had this idea of, hey, I deserve it, and the things I see, the things I want, I deserve it. And then he had a third step, kind of a fatal flaw, was this idea that he could handle it, right? So I want it, I deserve it, I can handle it. And so often that can be an attitude that will get us into trouble in our lives. And so we began looking at this guy and talking about some of the things, not so much... there are some things that we could see from him that can bring us encouragement, but there are some things we can see that, it's like a red flag. We need to be careful. Like, he's an example, but not all examples are good examples. Right, parents? That's what we tell our kids. And, there's good and there's bad, so pick your friends wisely and all those kinds of things. Listen, Samson was a guy who was emotion-driven, not spirit-led. He was emotion-driven, not spirit-led. He was emotional, and his emotions kind of, was the driving force too often in his life. And so we're going to talk about this kind of topic and things here this morning. So you stick with me as we do this. Now, listen, sometimes guys will be like, listen, I am not emotional. My wife's emotional. She's the one that she cries at the drop of a hat, or, it's this. We have this idea that, hey, I'm a big guy, I'm a strong guy, I'm a tough guy, emotions aren't bothering me or getting to me. But the reality of it is, there's all kinds of emotions. I mean, sometimes our emotions can cause us, to cry or to weep, to have that kind of a response. But there's other emotions, right? There's a lot of things that can happen to us. Here, example, anybody really have a desire to kind of engage our kids or spend time with our kids or quality time with our kids or quality time with our spouse and things. And although that's what I want to do and that's how I am, sometimes at the end of the day I could get home and I could be tired. And a lot of times with us guys, that's the time where we don't want to relive everything that's happened at work, right? That's the time we want to whatever, turn on the news or, just whatever. We want to veg out or do something. And although I may have a desire, that I really want to connect with my family, because of my emotions and how I feel, I kind of withdraw and get back from that place. Or does anybody ever say something stupid? No, it's just me. Yeah. Like, I'll say something stupid or do something stupid, and then it kind of blows up into like an exchange or an argument or, this, that, or whatever. And instead of just coming to a place to where I'll humble myself and apologize and just say, quickly say, hey, I was stupid. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. Sometimes we'll not do that. We'll not apologize or we'll hold on to things. Sometimes we'll blow up at somebody. And then afterwards, we're like, why did I do that? Or, why did I blow up like that? It's because sometimes we're driven by our emotions. It's like the things that we're dealing with and the things that we're going through are the things that determine how we react, how we respond, and how we do things. The Apostle Paul was writing in the book of Galatians, and he wrote these words in Galatians chapter 5. He said, so I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the sinful nature. For the sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature. They're in conflict with each other so that you do not do what you want. In Romans, the Apostle Paul said, and he takes it kind of this kind of idea and kind of builds on it. He says, you know what? He said, I don't do the things that I want to do, and the things that I don't want to do end up being the things that I end up doing. You ever feel that way? Quite frankly, we all struggle with that and feel this way. I'm not saying that we can just stop being emotional, and I'm not saying that we can get everything fixed, okay, to where we're always perfect. But if we can seek God and try and to live by the Spirit and allow God and the Spirit in His Word to have an impact in our lives, it can help us to get at a place to where we can stop doing the sinful things that we don't want to do and we can walk closer to God. And I really think that that's His desire for us. So the deal with Samson, we found him last week, Judges like 13, 14, 15, 16. You can read his story. And he had went to his mother and father and he had said, hey, I found this woman. I want her for my wife. So go get me this Philistine woman. And he wouldn't listen to reason. He wouldn't listen to his parents. He didn't really care what God wanted or anything. He just wanted to have this lady as his wife. And so through the progression of those things, we see that he went and he threw a party. He was having a festival, a time. They set up this wedding. And in their day, it wasn't a thing like, okay, we're getting married on Saturday at 2 or whatever, but it was a thing like for several days, a wedding feast and celebration and things was going on. And we talked about how you could kind of compare it to just having a keg party and just a big time of fun and frolicking, who frolics? Guys don't frolic, right? But just having fun and throwing a party for a week. And Samson, he's already making bad decisions. And while he's at this party, while he's there with these people, he's with about 30 other guys that are there, and he takes it a step further and continues to get himself in trouble. And Samson had a really good idea about who he was and what he was capable of. I mean, he thought he was the smartest, the best, the toughest, and all this kind of stuff. And so he comes up, he says, okay, I've got a bet. Who wants to take a bet? Or make a bet. And of course, guys are always competitive. And so it was quick and easy for him to get these 30 other guys to go in with him. And he's like, I've got a riddle. And if you can come up with an answer to this riddle, then here's what I'm going to do. I'll give you all a new set of clothes. I'll give you garments for all of you. And there's 30 of them. And he said, but if you can't guess the riddle, right? Then you all got to give me an outfit. Now, Samson maybe wasn't the brightest guy, because if he loses, he's got to get 30 garments, 30 sets of garments for these guys. And if the other guys lose, they just each have to come up with one. And so they all say, okay, and he says, I'll give you 7 days to be able to do it. And so the story goes that this is the riddle that Samson gives them. Judges 14:14. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. Okay? Now, last week, we talked about the events of what happened with Samson while he's going back and forth for this wedding, traveling to this town, this village that's a few miles away from where he lives. And there had been a time when he was going down the road and a lion jumped out, and instead of running like I would have, right, Samson goes on the attack and he kills this lion because he had superhuman strength, because he had God's strength and this kind of thing. And so he had killed this lion, never really talked about it too much. And then over the course of the events of days going by, he goes back, and that time he kind of is thinking, oh, I'll walk up and see what's going on with this, this dead lion. This is where that happened. And when he went by on a later date, he finds that there's bees that have built a nest inside the carcass of this lion, right? And so when he sees that, he's like, I'm kind of hungry. Honey's kind of good. So he reaches in and he takes out a scoop of the honeycomb or whatever, right? And he eats the honey. Now, one of the things with the vow that Samson took was that he couldn't be around dead animals, dead people. He couldn't be around dead things. He had to keep himself away from those to keep himself pure for this special vow that he took. And so when he shares his riddle, he's sharing the events of what's happened with the things of what he's done, right? Out of the eater, the lion, something sweet, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. So it's honey and a lion. And Samson, he's the only one that knows about this. And he's clever. And so he gives him this riddle. And then it says that for 3 days they couldn't give an answer. These 30 guys are racking their brains like, what in the world is this guy talking about? I mean, seriously, who would ever come up with this? Right? I mean, you ever hear of honey and a lion, a dead lion before, right? So it's impossible. But these guys, like most guys, right, they don't want to lose a bet. It's competition, right? It's personal. And so in the Bible, it tells us that these guys go up to Samson's future wife, right, his fiance, that he's already kind of entered into a contract with, because the wedding's a thing that doesn't just happen one day, it goes along, right? And so he's already in the midst of this wedding and stuff, and they go up to her and they say, listen, you have got to find out what this guy's talking about, and if you don't find out what he's talking about, you're going to suffer, you're going to pay, we're going to get you, we're going to get your dad, we're going to burn down the house, and you're going to be in it. They were serious. And so this wife, she comes in and does what wives do whenever they really want to get their husband's attention and want to make some, that just sounds like you wives are all manipulative, but I don't think that. But she goes up to Samson and she's crying. I mean, she didn't go up and say, listen, these guys are threatening me. You got to do something. She goes up to Samson and she says, what, you don't love me? Here you have this riddle, you have this thing, and you won't tell me the answer. How could you say that you love me if you won't tell me the answer to this riddle that you have? And so Samson doesn't tell her. She keeps crying. It goes on, and then finally Samson breaks down and he tells her the answer. So she takes and she goes to the guys that's threatening her, and she tells them. So here's how the story plays out. Before the sun set on the 7th day, the men of the town said to him, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And Samson said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. And I'm sitting here thinking, Samson, I know you're new to this marriage game, but don't ever, ever, ever call your wife a heifer again. How does he come out? You know, it's just like you look at that and you're like, Samson, you're a funny dude. But he gets upset and he knows what's happened. And so we find Samson in the middle of this crazy situation that he's already gotten himself into trouble. And now it's like, okay, where are we going to go from here? And today I want to talk to you. You know, we said Samson is emotion-driven, not spirit-led. And I want to talk to you about a couple emotions that I think that Samson had that caused him trouble. There are a couple emotions that we can have, whoever we are. And if we're not careful, these emotions will make us weak, even though we may be strong. They'll make us look foolish, even though we may be very talented. It'll trip us up, even though we may have all the potential in the world. And then one of the emotions Samson had was he burned with anger. He burned with anger. Well, go with me. So what's happened? He had this riddle, he made a bet, and just like I had to wear a Cubs uniform, Samson had to come up with 30 garments. But this is how he did it. The Bible says that he went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of their belongings, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Then the Bible's words, burning with anger, he went up to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to a friend who had attended him at his wedding. And so he's like, I've got to come up with 30 pairs of clothes. I made this stupid bet, and to pay the bet, I'm going to go kill 30 innocent men. And I'm going to take what they have, and I'm going to go pay off my bet. And then instead of sticking around for the wedding and stuff, he goes back to mom and dad's, which is really the place that he should have stayed to start with. And the text tells us that this father of the bride, he comes in and he's like, okay, what's a father to do? Here, I've got this daughter. I've paid for this wedding. We have this big celebration. And all of a sudden, the groom hates my daughter. He's run out on her. And you have to understand, in the culture and stuff, I mean, it was more than just, you know, it wasn't like us calling off. I mean, we know a lot of people that have been engaged or something and was, you know, talking about getting married and they called off the wedding and stuff. And it's kind of on down the road. It's not a big deal. But here in the setting, when the festival is already going on, it's a big deal. And so what happens is Samson goes back home and he's home for a little while. He's home for a while. And then one day he's like, you know, I'd kind of like to kiss my wife a little bit. I'd like to see her. So I'm going to go back over to her father's house and find her. And when he gets there, the father says, oh, no, wait a second. Listen, you can't go into her room. I thought you hated her, so I gave her to marry your best man. And then Samson really got upset. The story, if you read it, tells us that Samson goes out, and he's kind of like, you know, last time I got ticked off, it was my fault, right? And it was on me. Those 30 guys, that was on me. I shouldn't have done it. But he's like, listen, this time you're the one that's messed up. So now what happens? It's all on you. This crazy stuff. He goes out and traps 30 foxes. Or 300 foxes, I'm sorry. He traps 300 foxes. He takes the foxes, ties their tails together. Then he takes a torch between their tails, and he sets them loose in their fields. And the foxes running around with fire on their tails, sets fire to all of their crops, burns down their olive trees, burns down the grain that's stored, burns down all of these things, all because the father of the bride gave away his wife. You know those guys that told her, if you don't find the answer to this riddle, we're going to get you, we're going to kill you? Well, the reality of it is, after Samson turned the foxes loose, they went back and they did what they threatened to do. They found the girl, they found her father, and they died. And Samson, in his anger, in his emotional state, ends up cost himself, but not just himself, he cost the people that he loved. He cost the people that was around him. And cost them a lot, cost them their life. And the truth is, for a lot of us, we could say, okay, listen, Steve, I'm not killing nobody, right? And I certainly wouldn't know where to go catch 300 foxes. This is just like a Bible story. This is just a story. But the truth is, for a lot of us, anger is kind of the default mode that we fall back on whenever we're dealing with stuff and struggling with things. There's a lot of times that maybe out of embarrassment, we could respond. We're embarrassed, and that's what we're feeling, but we could lash out in anger. There's a lot of times to where I've responded hatefully or angry, and it wasn't really anything except that I was hurt. I was embarrassed. I was hurt. I was struggling. I was confronted with something, confronted with a circumstance, and my natural instinct is to jump out and to respond with anger. Has anybody here ever put something hateful on Facebook that after you have put something on Facebook, you're like, later on, you're like, dude, I shouldn't have said that like that. That sounded bad. Oh, I know. It's never us that does it, but we've all seen that people have done this on Facebook, right? Things that happen, we explode, we get into a shouting match with our spouse. Listen, I can think back some of the biggest fights we've ever had with Denise. I'm like, how did that even happen, or why did that happen? We just get so caught up in it. Why do you think Samson was so angry? I mean, seriously, when we stop and we look at his story, isn't it true that Samson's the one that was walking down in around the Philistine village and saw this girl that he really wasn't supposed to marry or associate with because she didn't have faith in God? Wasn't it Samson that picked this girl? I mean, his mom and dad didn't go out and pick her for him, right? It wasn't God that picked her. Wasn't it Samson that decided that he was going to go and he was going to marry this lady? Listen, whose idea was it to come up with this silly riddle? Wasn't it Samson that said, hey, I've got something, I'll give you 7 days? Wasn't it Samson that named the price on what was the bet? Clothes for you or clothes for me? And seriously, wasn't Samson the only one that knew the answer to the riddle? I mean, in the text it says, hey, I didn't even tell my mom and dad. Why would I tell my wife? I'm not telling anybody. He's the one that gave the secret away. And who's the one that left his wife at the altar? Nobody chased him away. It said that burning with anger, he ran back home to his mother and father's house. Samson's mad at everybody else, but really, shouldn't Samson have been mad at himself? Could it be that sometimes we're mad at our boss and we're mad at the circumstance of what we have and what we're having to deal with? And the reality of it is sometimes we have an idea like this job is beneath me, or I deserve more than this. But the reality is sometimes we're the one that didn't go to school, or we're the one that didn't get the training. We're the one that made the decisions that we made that brought us and led us to the place to where we're working the job that we're having to work with. And it's not really our boss's fault. Maybe as a husband or wife, we can get mad at our spouse, and we're like, oh, well, she doesn't give me enough physical attention. Or we could be like, he doesn't give me enough, he's not meeting my emotional needs. But the truth of it is, neither one of us are really trying to meet the needs of the other person. And maybe we're just mad, and really the person we ought to be mad at is we ought to be mad at ourselves. I've talked to a lot of people who've been mad at God. Sometimes, man, we can just, God, why'd you let me get to this place? Or why am I having to deal with this? But all too often, we end up dealing with consequences in our life that's brought about by the actions that we've taken. And sometimes we're dealing with the fact that, oh, well, I can't get a good job because of my record. And the truth is, the mistakes we've made are following along with us. Sometimes it's, man, I lost my job, but you lost your job because you failed a drug test that was really your fault and your reason. The truth of it is, sometimes we want to blame everybody else except the person that really deserves the blame. Samson's mad at everybody else. And the truth is that his decisions and his attitude and his emotions and being driven by his emotions are bringing him to the place to where he's struggling and having trouble. I would just say to you that sometimes if we don't get our act together, if we can't stop and recognize some of the things that's going on in our lives, if we keep doing the same bad things all the time, if we keep following our same bad emotions all the time, then we're going to get the same results that we've been getting. Samson was driven by anger. Samson also was struggling with pride. Struggling with pride. See, unfortunately for Samson, the story didn't end right there. When he found out what had happened to his wife and what they had done to his, what could have been, should have been father-in-law, it says that Samson went and found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Then Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men. I would just say to you that the reason that Samson was able to do what he's able to do wasn't really so much about his own personal ability, but the power that God had given him. I mean, the reason why Samson was as strong as what he was is because God had done some things with him and intended to do some things with him in his life. And yet here as he gets angry, here as he lashes out at the people that's hurting him, the first thing that comes out of his mouth is, look what I have done. Everybody better watch out. Everybody better stand back. You know, the funny thing is that he says, with a donkey's jawbone, I've made donkeys out of them. Kind of carries with it the idea of him calling them donkeys. You know, there's other terms for donkeys. And so kind of a play on words to where he's standing up, and in his pride and in his arrogance, Samson says, don't mess with me. Don't cross me. See what's going to happen if you come after me? And the truth is that Samson continues to build the story of his life, and to him, the story is all about Samson. Like he's the center of attention, like he's the center of the story. We want to be the character, the main character. We want to be in control. We want to do what we want to do. We want to be it. And the truth is that God is the main character. Poor Samson comes through all of these things, and at the end he finds himself as being in need. And Samson has a need. And he's been doing all this stuff, trying to make himself happy, trying to find the things that can keep him satisfied, thinking that he has everything under control, thinking that it's all about him and that he deserves whatever he wants and he can handle whatever comes along. And the reality is, at the end of this story, he finds himself where he feels like life's over, there's no hope, he's sitting, he's thirsty, he's alone, he's going to die. But fortunately for Samson, in his need, he cries out to God. Now, I don't know what your need is today. Okay, here's what I believe. We all have needs. And I mean, some of us can be in a place to where we're in dire need. And you're here this morning and you're like, dude, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm about to give up. There's no hope. things are so bad, things are so rough. I would say this: if we allow our need to drive us to God, God will meet your deepest need. If in our time of need we can allow that and turn to God and trust God and give it to God, then God will work to be able to meet our need in our life. For all of us, we have a choice, man. It's either going to drive us to God or it's going to drive us away from God. And I don't know where you are in your life, but my encouragement to you today is that you need to turn to God. The Bible says that because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord. You've given your servant this great victory. Oh, now he gives God the credit. Before it was, look what I did. I took a donkey's jawbone and I made donkeys out of all these guys. But now he's turning to God and he's changing his story. He says, you have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? Then God opened up the hollow at a place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned, and he was revived. When he turned to God and trusted God and poured out his heart to God, God met his need. And sometimes when we're driven by our emotions, it drives us to do things and make decisions that are difficult, decisions that don't help. Sometimes through our emotions. And I mean, emotions can be, there's anger, there's pride, there's fear, there's insecurity, there's, just a sense of loss of hope. And sometimes through those things, our tendency is to withdraw from family, to withdraw from friends, to withdraw from God. Our tendency is to work harder, to work longer. Sometimes our tendency is just to consume more alcohol or pick up the drug or step into that illicit relationship. Sometimes our tendency is to be reckless, to be violent. We respond out of our emotions. We're driven by our emotions. When all along what we really need to do is to be led by the Spirit, to allow God to speak to us, to allow God to help us, to realize that we need help, and then to accept the help. To turn to God, to turn to other people, to be able to help us in our lives. Listen, you can have faith, you can be a Christian, you can believe in God, right? And we have these things, and that's great. But you need more than just you and God. You need a church. You need a spiritual family. I'm not the one that says it. God's the one that's put it and said it this way. God's the one that set it up this way. That we would turn to Him and allow Him to minister to us. If you'll let your needs drive you to God, God will meet your deepest needs. Won't you turn to Him today? Join me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for who you are and what you've done. And God, quite honestly, man, there's so many of us here in this room that our story is very similar to Samson's. And when we're honest and we stop and we can look at things, we can see that there's been too many times that we're being driven by our emotions and that we're not walking with you and walking with your Spirit. God, I pray that today that you've spoken to our hearts and softened our hearts. And God, that we could look and we could see that in you lies our hope. In you lies our strength. May we be willing to lay down and to humble ourselves, to acknowledge the things that we've done, and God, that we could acknowledge that we have a need for you. God, through the work of your Spirit, through the power of the cross of Jesus, may we let you meet our need today. I love you. God, we thank you and praise you for all that you do. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Listen, sometimes as the band comes and we wrap up this morning, sometimes we'll talk about entering into a relationship with Jesus, right? And we'll pray a prayer and say some things, to share some things. Listen, it's not so much a magic formula of the things that you could say, but it's an attitude that we have in our heart. Coming to a place to where we can say, God, I know I'm a sinner. I know I've messed up. God, I want your forgiveness. I believe that what Jesus did can pay the debt that I owe. And when we take that and we internalize it in our lives, and God, I have this need that only you can meet through what Jesus did. Forgive me. I want to walk with you and follow you. I want to have your presence in my life. You can say those words in whatever language could be spoken here on earth. You could change those words and say it in however you talk and whatever. It's not so much like saying the perfect words, but it's having the right attitude and the right faith and turning to God and receiving his forgiveness. And here's the coolest thing, is that when we do that, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. God always gives you his forgiveness and his love and his mercy. I hope that you'll be back next week as we continue and talk and look at the life here of Samson. You know, the thing with Samson was God wanted him to help the people of Israel to get, they had been under the oppression of these Philistines for a long time. At the end of this story, the Bible says that for 20 years, the Israelites kind of lived in peace. And Samson worked with them for 20 years. But after about 20 years, he began to have some issues again, and his attitude kind of shifted. And so his story goes on. I hope you'll be here next week as we talk about those things. God bless you. Get involved in church, right? If not this church, then you find a church, a good church that preaches the Bible, but you need it. We need it. God bless you.